The glass shattered against the marble floor before Eleanor could even set down the tray. Duke Cassius Vaughn stood over the broken shards, his face twisted with the same cold anger he wore every evening at this hour, and he did not look at his wife as he spoke. "Clean it," he said. "That is the one thing you seem capable of doing without failing me." Eleanor knelt without a word. Around them, two servants pretended not to watch, though everyone in Ashcombe Hall had long grown used to the sound of the Duke's temper. 5 years of marriage had taught her that silence was safer than an answer, that a lowered head drew less cruelty than a raised voice. She picked up each fragment of glass carefully, her fingers steady despite the heat rising in her chest, and when she finally looked up, Cassius had already walked away, his boots echoing down the corridor toward the room where his mistress waited. This was the shape of her life. Not sudden and violent, but slow and grinding, wearing her down the way water wears down stone. She had come to this house at 19, a bride chosen for a modest inheritance, and a family name that meant nothing beside the Vaughn fortune. Cassius had wanted the land attached to her dowry, a strip of farmland bordering his eastern estate, nothing more. He had never wanted her. She rose to her feet, set the broken glass onto the tray, and walked toward the kitchens. The cook, a broad woman named Margaret Wells, glanced up and immediately softened her expression, the way she always did when she saw the Duchess arrive with that particular stillness in her eyes. "He broke another one," Margaret said. It was not a question. "He was tired," Eleanor answered, though both women knew that was not the reason. Margaret took the tray from her hands and set it aside, then reached out and touched Eleanor's arm, a brief gesture of comfort that neither of them spoke about afterward. "You deserve better than this house, my lady. Every soul under this roof knows it, even if none of us dares say so where he might hear." Eleanor managed a faint smile. "It does not matter what any of us think. This is my life now, and I have made my peace with it." But that was not entirely true, and she knew it even as she said the words. She had not made peace. She had simply learned to survive, the way a plant learns to grow around a stone it cannot move. At night, after Cassius had gone to whichever room he preferred that evening, Eleanor would sit at the small writing desk in her chamber and lose herself in numbers and letters, going through the estate's accounts that no one else bothered to check, correcting errors the steward made, tracking the harvest yields against the previous year's records. It was the only part of her day that felt like it belonged to her. She had a mind for it, though no one in this house had ever asked. Her own father, before his death, had taught her to read ledgers the way other girls were taught to embroider, insisting that a woman who understood money could never be entirely powerless. She had not understood his urgency then. She understood it now, in a house where her husband controlled every coin that passed through her hands, and mocked her for asking questions about where the money went. That evening, as she walked the long corridor back to her chamber, she passed the open door of the drawing room and heard Cassius laughing with his companions, a group of young lords who visited often and drank late into the night. She paused only a moment, long enough to hear her own name spoken with contempt. "My wife," Cassius was saying, his voice thick with wine and amusement, "is about as interesting as a stone wall. I could talk to the wall and get more conversation out of it." The men laughed. One of them, a thin-faced lord named Julian Ashcombe, added something about how at least a stone wall did not need feeding, and the laughter grew louder. Eleanor stood in the shadow of the corridor, her hand pressed flat against the cool stone, and let the words wash over her without letting them show on her face. She had heard worse. She had heard this exact joke before, in different rooms, told by different men, who found her silence an easy target. She continued to her chamber, closed the door quietly behind her, and sat at her desk. She did not cry. She had cried during the first year of her marriage, in the early months when she still believed that patience and kindness might eventually soften her husband's heart. She had stopped crying somewhere around the second year, when she finally understood that Cassius did not see her as a person to be won over, only as an obligation to be endured until something more interesting came along. What he did not know, what no one in Ashcombe Hall knew, was that Eleanor's family held a secret far older and far heavier than anyone suspected. Her mother had died when she was a child, and her mother's father, a reclusive nobleman named Edmund Whitmore, had cut off all contact with the family decades ago, after a bitter dispute over inheritance and pride. Eleanor had met him only once, when she was 11 years old, a brief and awkward visit to a vast estate in the Northern Territories that she remembered mostly as cold hallways, and a grandfather who studied her with sharp, assessing eyes before sending her home without warmth. She had not thought of him in years. He was a stranger, connected to her only by blood, a man whose choices had nothing to do with the life she now lived. She did not know, as she sat at her desk that night correcting the steward's arithmetic, that Edmund Whitmore had spent the last 3 years of his life quietly reversing the very decision that had once torn their family apart, that he had watched from a distance as his granddaughter was married off to a man who did not deserve her, and that his final act on this earth would change everything she believed about her own worth. The letter arrived on a gray morning in early autumn, delivered by a courier who insisted on placing it directly into Eleanor's hands, rather than leaving it with the household staff. She recognized the seal immediately, though it had been years since she had seen it, a wax stamp bearing the Whitmore crest, a hawk with wings spread wide. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke it open, standing in the entrance hall while Cassius watched from the top of the staircase with mild curiosity, the first genuine attention he had paid her in weeks. "Who writes to you?" he asked, descending the stairs slowly. "My grandfather," she said, scanning the first lines. Or rather, his solicitor. Cassius's interest sharpened slightly at the word solicitor, though he tried to mask it with indifference. "What does the old man want after all this time? I thought your family had no contact with him." "We didn't," Eleanor said quietly, still reading. The words on the page seemed to blur and rearrange themselves as she absorbed their meaning. Edmund Whitmore was dead. He had passed away peacefully at his estate 3 weeks prior, and his solicitor was writing to inform her, as his sole surviving direct descendant, that she was required to appear at the reading of his will. She folded the letter carefully and looked up to find Cassius watching her with an expression she rarely saw on his face, something close to interest. "He is dead," she said simply. "I am asked to attend the reading of his will." Cassius laughed, though there was little warmth in it. "I doubt the old recluse left you more than a token. Men like that die bitter, and leave their fortunes to distant cousins out of spite, just to ensure no one who actually loved them gets a coin." He turned and began walking back toward his study, already losing interest. "Go if you must. Take the carriage. I have no time to accompany you on such a small errand." Eleanor watched him go, the letter still in her hand, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, the faint, cautious stirring of curiosity about her own life, about a part of her past that had nothing to do with the man she had married. She did not know what waited for her at the reading of the will. She did not dare hope for anything significant. But for the first time in years, she felt the smallest flicker of something that was entirely her own, untouched by her husband's contempt or his indifference. The journey to the Northern Territories took 4 days by carriage, and Eleanor made it alone, accompanied only by a maid named Beatrice, who had served the Vaughn household for a decade, and who had grown fond of the quiet Duchess, despite the danger of showing too much loyalty in a house ruled by cruelty. Beatrice noticed the change in Eleanor almost immediately, the way she sat straighter in the carriage, the way her eyes seemed to focus on the passing countryside with genuine interest, rather than the practiced blankness she wore at Ashcombe Hall. "You seem different, my lady," Beatrice observed on the second day of travel, as the carriage rolled through hills turning gold with the season. "I feel different," Eleanor admitted. "I do not know why. Perhaps it is simply the distance from that house." Beatrice said nothing further, but she smiled to herself, hoping quietly that whatever waited at the end of this journey might give her mistress a reason to smile more often. When they finally arrived at Whitmore Manor, Eleanor was struck by how much larger and more impressive the estate appeared than she remembered from her childhood visit. The manor house itself was vast, built of pale gray stone, with towers at each corner, surrounded by grounds that stretched farther than she could see in any direction. A steward greeted her at the entrance, an older man with kind eyes named Nathaniel Cole, who introduced himself as her grandfather's solicitor and personal advisor for the last 20 years. "Lady Eleanor," he said, bowing slightly, "your grandfather spoke of you often in his final years, though I understand you had little contact during that time." "None at all," Eleanor said honestly. "I did not know he thought of me at all." Nathaniel's expression softened. "He thought of little else, my lady, especially toward the end. There is much to discuss, but I believe it would be better done inside, and in private." He led her through the grand entrance hall, past portraits of Whitmore ancestors staring down from gilded frames, and into a study lined floor to ceiling with books. There, waiting at a long table, sat two other solicitors and a clerk with stacks of documents already prepared. Eleanor took her seat, feeling suddenly small in the presence of so much formality, and waited as Nathaniel Cole cleared his throat and began to read. The will was long, filled with legal language that took time to unravel, but the essential truth of it became clear within the first few minutes, and it struck Eleanor with such force that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. Edmund Whitmore had left the entirety of his estate, not to distant cousins, not to charity, not to anyone else who might have expected a claim, but to her alone. The lands, the properties, the accumulated wealth of a lifetime, spent building one of the largest private fortunes in the Northern Territories. All of it now belonged to Eleanor. But the will contained more than simple inheritance. Nathaniel Cole paused before continuing, glancing at her with something like sympathy, before he explained the deeper history behind the bequest. Decades earlier, Edmund Whitmore had been involved in a land dispute with the Vaughn family, a dispute that had ended in a treaty granting the Whitmore family permanent rights to a vast stretch of territory that bordered, and in several key places overlapped with, the lands claimed by the Duke of Vaughan. The treaty had been buried, forgotten by most, kept alive only through careful legal maintenance by men like Nathaniel Cole who understood its significance. By the terms of that old treaty, whoever held the Whitmore inheritance held legal claim to nearly half of what Cassius Vaughn considered his own domain. Eleanor sat in stunned silence as the full weight of this information settled over her. She was no longer simply the quiet, overlooked wife of a cruel duke. She was, by law and by blood, one of the wealthiest and most powerful landholders in the entire region, holding claim to territory that her own husband did not even realize was contested. "Does my husband know of this treaty?" she asked quietly, once she had found her voice again. "I do not believe so, my lady," Nathaniel said. "Your grandfather kept this matter extremely private, precisely because he feared what might happen if the wrong person learned of it too soon. He wanted you to have every advantage before anyone else understood what you now possess." Eleanor looked down at the documents spread before her, the deeds and titles and legal records that would reshape the entire balance of power in her marriage, and felt a strange calm settle over her, the kind of stillness that comes not from fear but from clarity. For years, she had been made to feel small, unworthy, a disappointment tolerated only because of a modest dowry. Now she understood that she had been sitting on a foundation of power all along, hidden beneath the surface like roots beneath soil, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. "I will need time to understand everything you have shown me," she told Nathaniel Cole, "and I will need your continued guidance in managing what has been entrusted to me. But I do not intend to rush back to Ashcombe Hall and announce this to my husband before I fully understand what it means." Nathaniel nodded, clearly relieved by her caution. "A wise decision, my lady. Knowledge is a kind of armor. It is best worn quietly until the moment it is needed." That night, alone in a guest chamber within Whitmore Manor, Eleanor sat by the window and looked out over grounds that now belonged to her, grounds more vast and beautiful than anything she had seen in her married life. She thought of Cassius, of his cruelty and his indifference, of the years she had spent shrinking herself to fit inside the small space he allowed her. She thought of the way he had laughed with his friends, calling her a stone wall, believing she had nothing to offer beyond silence and obedience. He had no idea what waited for him. He had no idea that the quiet woman he had spent 5 years mocking now held, in her own name, the power to reshape everything he believed about his own kingdom. Eleanor did not yet know what she would do with this knowledge, whether she would confront him immediately or wait for a moment of her own choosing. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty as she watched the stars appear over her grandfather's land. She was no longer powerless, and nothing about her life would ever be the same again. Eleanor returned to Ashcombe Hall 6 days later, and she said nothing about the inheritance. Cassius barely looked up from his correspondence when she entered the drawing room, offering only a brief, disinterested question about whether the old man had left her anything worth mentioning. "A small property in the north," she said, keeping her voice carefully flat. "Nothing of great consequence." It was the first lie she had told him in 5 years of marriage, and it came easier than she expected. She had spent the carriage ride home deciding exactly how much to reveal and when, and she had concluded, with the same careful logic she applied to the estate's ledgers, That information was only powerful when it was controlled. If Cassius learned too soon what she now possessed, he would find some way to twist it to his advantage, to claim it as his own, through the authority a husband held over his wife's property. She needed time. She needed to understand the treaty fully, to secure her claim so completely that no one, not even a duke, could take it from her. So she returned to her old routines, the quiet obedience, the downcast eyes, the careful silence at dinner, while Cassius spoke of politics and land and money with his companions. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. She began corresponding secretly with Nathaniel Cole, using Beatrice to carry letters to a post office in the nearby village, rather than trusting the household courier, who reported everything to Cassius out of habit and fear. Nathaniel sent her copies of the old treaty, explanations of the legal processes required to formally activate her claim, and careful guidance on how to proceed without alerting anyone prematurely. The treaty, she learned, was more significant than even the initial reading of the will had suggested. Nearly a century earlier, a Whitmore ancestor and a Vaughn ancestor had settled a violent dispute over a river valley and its surrounding farmland through a formal agreement, one that granted joint stewardship of the territory to both families, contingent on marriage alliances or direct inheritance. Over the generations, the Vaughn family had quietly absorbed most of the practical control over the land, paying token acknowledgments to the Whitmore side while treating the territory as fully their own. But the legal foundation of that arrangement had never been dissolved. It sat dormant in old records, waiting for a Whitmore heir to assert their claim. Eleanor was that heir, and by the strict letter of the treaty, nearly half of what Cassius Vaughn called his kingdom, the eastern farmlands, the river trade routes, the mills that ground grain for half the region, all of it fell under a claim that she now legally possessed. She did not rush. She spent weeks learning the details, meeting secretly with Nathaniel Cole under the guise of visiting a sick relative, having him explain the process of formally registering her claim with the Crown's land office. It was delicate work, made more difficult by the need for absolute secrecy, but Eleanor found that she was good at it, that the same careful, patient mind she had used for years to survive her marriage now served her in navigating a far more consequential game. Meanwhile, life at Ashcombe Hall continued its familiar, painful rhythm. Cassius's cruelty had not softened during her absence. If anything, it had sharpened, as though her brief departure had reminded him how much he enjoyed having someone beneath him to mock. He took a new mistress that autumn, a young woman named Camille Hartley, who had arrived at court with ambitions of her own, and who quickly understood that flattering the Duke's vanity was the surest path to comfort and influence. Camille made no effort to hide her presence in the household, often appearing at meals that Eleanor also attended, wearing jewelry that Eleanor recognized as pieces that had once belonged to Cassius's mother, family heirlooms given away to a mistress, while the Duchess wore the same 3 dresses she had brought with her from her father's house. "You do not seem troubled by her," Camille said to Eleanor one afternoon, finding her alone in the garden. There was a cruelty in the question, disguised as curiosity, an attempt to provoke some reaction that could be reported back to Cassius as amusing gossip. "Why would I be troubled?" Eleanor replied evenly, continuing to trim the roses she tended most mornings, one of the few tasks in the household that still belonged entirely to her. "My husband's choices are his own to make. I have long since stopped expecting them to include me." Camille studied her for a long moment, clearly disappointed by the lack of drama, then wandered off toward the house, already bored with a target that refused to break. Eleanor watched her go, and felt nothing but a distant, almost clinical pity. She thought of the papers hidden in a locked drawer in her chamber, the growing correspondence with Nathaniel Cole, the slow, careful construction of a claim that would one day make every insult Camille Hartley had ever offered feel very small indeed. But patience was not the same as peace, and there were nights when the weight of everything she carried felt unbearable. She confided in no one at Ashcombe Hall except Beatrice, who had proven herself loyal beyond question, and even then, she shared only fragments, careful never to reveal the full scope of what she knew. Beatrice sensed the change in her mistress, the new steadiness beneath the familiar quiet, but she did not ask questions she suspected she was not meant to answer. "You are different since you returned from the north," Beatrice said one evening, as she helped Eleanor prepare for bed. "Not sad different. Something else, like a candle that has been lit in a room that used to be dark." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile at the description. Perhaps I have simply remembered that I exist beyond these walls, Beatrice. That there is a world outside this house where I am not merely a disappointment to be tolerated." "You were never a disappointment, my lady," Beatrice said fiercely, surprising herself with the force of her own words. "Begging your pardon for speaking so plainly, but his grace is a fool, and every servant in this house has said as much in whispers for years." Eleanor said nothing, but she reached out and squeezed Beatrice's hand in gratitude, a small gesture that carried more warmth than words could have offered. The months passed, and Eleanor's claim slowly took formal shape. Nathaniel Cole worked with the Crown's Land Office to register the inheritance and the accompanying treaty rights, a process complicated by the age of the original documents and the need to verify their authenticity through careful historical research. He warned Eleanor repeatedly that once the claim was formally recorded, it would become public knowledge, accessible to anyone who searched the Crown's records, including her husband should he ever think to look. There would be no more hiding it once the process was complete. "I understand," Eleanor told him during one of their secret meetings, held this time in a quiet inn along the road between Ashcombe Hall and the village, far from prying eyes. "I do not intend to hide it forever. I only wanted to be certain of my ground before anyone else learned to challenge it." "You have chosen your ground well, my lady," Nathaniel said, gathering the papers between them. "By the time this becomes known, there will be nothing anyone can do to unmake it. The law will stand entirely in your favor." Eleanor nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of relief and apprehension that had accompanied every step of this process. She thought often of the moment when Cassius would finally learn the truth, imagining it in different forms depending on her mood, sometimes picturing herself calmly presenting the documents at dinner, other times imagining a furious confrontation that she was not certain she wanted to face. She did not know, in those quiet months of careful preparation, exactly how the revelation would come. She only knew that it was coming, inevitable as the turning of the seasons, and that when it arrived, everything between her and Cassius would be forced into the light. In the meantime, she continued to endure the small daily cruelties of her marriage, the dismissive comments at dinner, the casual disrespect from Camille Hartley, the way Cassius spoke over her in conversation, as though her opinions carried no weight worth considering. But something had shifted within her, a quiet strength that had not existed before her journey to the north. She found herself standing a little straighter, meeting cruel comments with a calm, level gaze, rather than the flinching silence she had offered for years. Cassius did not seem to notice the change. Too absorbed in his own pleasures and pursuits to pay close attention to a wife, he had long since stopped considering worthy of real observation. But others in the household noticed, the servants who had watched her endure so much for so long, who now saw something new taking root behind her quiet eyes. Margaret Wells, the cook, remarked on it one evening, as Eleanor lingered in the kitchen after the household had gone to bed, unable to sleep, and finding comfort in the warm, familiar space where she had spent so many quiet hours over the years. "You carry yourself different these days, my lady," Margaret said, kneading bread dough for the following morning. "Like a woman who knows something the rest of us don't." "Perhaps I do," Eleanor admitted, allowing herself a rare moment of honesty. "Perhaps there is more to this life than what I have been permitted to show." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had long suspected. "Whatever it is, my lady, I hope it brings you the peace you deserve. This house has taken enough from you already." Eleanor thought of those words often in the weeks that followed, as the formal registration of her claim moved closer to completion. She did not know exactly what shape her future would take once the truth was finally revealed, whether it would bring peace or further conflict, whether Cassius would react with fury or, against all expectation, with something resembling respect. But she knew that whatever came next would be met by a different woman than the one who had first arrived at Ashcombe Hall 5 years earlier, uncertain and eager to please. That woman had learned, through years of quiet suffering, exactly how much strength could be built in silence, and she was no longer willing to remain small, simply because someone else found it convenient. The final documents arrived from Nathaniel Cole on a cold morning in early winter, delivered discreetly through Beatrice as always, confirming that Eleanor's claim to the Whitmore inheritance, and the treaty rights bound to it, had been formally and permanently recorded with the Crown. There was no more waiting to be done. The truth existed now in official records, waiting only for someone to notice it, and Eleanor understood, as she read the confirmation by candlelight in her locked chamber, that the quiet chapter of her plan had finally come to an end. Somewhere beyond these walls, in offices and archives she had never visited, her name now stood recorded beside claims to land and wealth that would stagger even the proudest members of the nobility. She folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others in the locked drawer, then extinguished her candle and lay awake in the darkness, listening to the distant sound of Cassius's laughter echoing from the drawing room below, where he entertained his friends with stories that likely included some fresh mockery of his quiet, forgettable wife. Let him laugh, she thought, closing her eyes. He would not laugh for much longer. The truth came out at a winter gathering hosted by Lord Harold Pembridge, an event that drew nearly every notable family in the region to his grand estate for an evening of music, food, and the kind of political conversation that shaped alliances and rivalries for years to come. Eleanor had not wanted to attend, sensing somehow that the quiet order of her life was approaching its final days, but Cassius had insisted, eager to display his wife as a symbol of respectability, even as he ignored her the moment they arrived. The hall was filled with candlelight and the low hum of conversation when Julian Ashcombe, the same thin-faced lord who had once compared Eleanor to a stone wall, approached Cassius with a strange, gleeful expression that immediately put Eleanor on alert. She stood a short distance away, half hidden by a pillar, and listened as Julian spoke in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the small crowd gathered nearby. "Cassius, my old friend," Julian said, raising his glass in a mocking toast, "I must congratulate you on your remarkable fortune. I had no idea your quiet little wife was sitting on half a kingdom." Cassius laughed, assuming this was the beginning of some joke at Eleanor's expense, the kind of humor his friends often indulged in at her cost. "Half a kingdom? I think you have had too much wine, Julian. My wife brought nothing to this marriage but a small strip of farmland and a face that rarely smiles." Julian's grin widened, and he glanced around at the small crowd that had begun to gather, sensing an audience for what he clearly considered delicious news. "Then you have not seen the Crown's land registry, my friend. I happened to be reviewing some property disputes for my own estate last week, and I came across a rather fascinating entry. It seems your Duchess Eleanor holds legal claim, through an old treaty tied to her grandfather's inheritance, to nearly half the territory you have spent your entire life calling your own. The eastern farmlands, the river mills, even the trade routes along the northern road, all of it, my friend, technically belongs to her." The color drained from Cassius's face as the crowd around him began to murmur, some in disbelief, others already recalculating the social hierarchy of the room based on this astonishing revelation. Eleanor stood frozen behind the pillar, her heart pounding, watching the moment she had spent months preparing for unfold, not on her own terms, but through the careless, gleeful mouth of a man who clearly relished her husband's public humiliation. Cassius turned, his eyes searching the room until they found her, and the fury that crossed his face was unlike anything Eleanor had seen from him before, even in his cruelest moments. He crossed the room in a few sharp strides and gripped her arm, pulling her away from the crowd toward a quiet corridor just off the main hall. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you hold some claim to my lands?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch, despite the tight grip on her arm. "It is true," she said. "My grandfather left me his entire estate, including a treaty that predates your family's control over that territory, by nearly a century. I have registered the claim formally with the Crown. It is fully legal and fully binding." "You knew," Cassius said, his voice rising, disbelief and fury warring in his expression. "You knew for months, and said nothing. You let me believe it was a worthless piece of northern property." "I said nothing," Eleanor agreed, her voice remaining calm even as her heart raced, "because for 5 years, you have given me no reason to believe you would treat me with anything other than contempt if I handed you power over my own affairs. I have watched you make decisions about this household, about our finances, about our lives, without once asking my opinion or valuing my judgment. Why would I have offered you knowledge of something this significant, only to watch you claim it as your own, and continue treating me exactly as you always have?" Cassius released her arm, stepping back as though her words had physically struck him. For the first time in their marriage, Eleanor watched something other than contempt cross his face. A flicker of genuine shock, perhaps even the first faint edges of shame. "You tried to be a partner to me once," he said slowly, memory surfacing unwillingly. In the early months, you asked about the estate, about the tenants, about the harvest reports. I did, Eleanor said, and you told me a wife's place was to look pleasant and remain quiet, that matters of the estate were beyond a woman's understanding. I remember every word, Cassius, because I heard some version of it nearly every week for 5 years. The corridor fell silent between them, the distant sound of music and conversation from the main hall feeling suddenly very far away. Cassius stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her. The woman he had dismissed as dull and forgettable now standing before him, holding more legal power over his own lands than he possessed himself. "What do you intend to do with this claim?" he finally asked, and there was something almost fearful in the question now, a recognition that the balance between them had shifted in ways he could not yet fully calculate. "I have not decided," Eleanor answered honestly, "but I can promise you this, Cassius. Whatever I decide, I will decide it as myself, not as an extension of your name or your wishes. You spent 5 years making certain I understood how little my voice mattered in this marriage. You will now learn exactly how much it matters, whether you like the lesson or not." She turned and walked back toward the main hall, leaving him standing alone in the corridor, and for the remainder of that evening, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes following her every movement, nobles and ladies alike recalculating everything they thought they knew about the quiet duchess who had spent years fading into the background of every room she entered. She held her head high, met their gazes without apology, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to feel something that resembled pride. The carriage ride back to Ashcombe Hall passed in tense silence, Cassius staring out the window with a rigid jaw, while Eleanor sat opposite him, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Neither of them spoke until they arrived at the house, and even then, Cassius disappeared immediately into his study without a word, leaving Eleanor to climb the stairs alone to her chamber, where Beatrice waited with wide, anxious eyes. "Is it true, my lady?" Beatrice asked. "The servants are already whispering. They say Lord Ashcombe announced something at the gathering, something about you owning half the Duke's lands." "It is true," Eleanor said, sitting down heavily on the edge of her bed, the exhaustion of the evening finally catching up with her. "Everyone knows now. There is no more hiding it." Beatrice's face broke into a smile so wide and genuine that Eleanor found herself laughing softly, despite the tension still coiled in her chest. "Oh, my lady, after everything this house has put you through, I could not be happier for you if the news were my own." "It does not change everything," Eleanor cautioned, though even she could hear the shift in her own voice, the new steadiness that had not existed there before. "Cassius is still my husband. This house is still my home, but something has changed, Beatrice, something fundamental. I do not yet know what it means for the rest of my life, but I know it means I will never again be the woman who quietly cleaned up broken glass without a word of protest." Beatrice helped her prepare for bed in comfortable silence, and long after the candles were extinguished, Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening's events over and over in her mind. She thought of the shock on Cassius's face, the fury that had quickly given way to something more complicated, something almost like fear. She thought of Julian Ashcombe's gleeful expression as he delivered the news that would upend her entire marriage, and she wondered, with a distant sort of curiosity, whether he had understood the magnitude of what he was setting into motion, or whether he had simply enjoyed the momentary pleasure of humiliating a man he had always secretly envied. Sleep did not come easily that night, but when it finally did, Eleanor dreamed not of Ashcombe Hall, or the years of quiet suffering she had endured within its walls, but of the wide, open grounds of Whitmore Manor, of grand rooms filled with light rather than shadow, of a future that belonged entirely to her, shaped by her own hands rather than the careless cruelty of a man who had never bothered to see her true worth. She woke the next morning to find the household already buzzing with news of the previous night's revelation, servants exchanging whispered gossip in corners, Cassius nowhere to be found, having apparently left before dawn to consult with his own solicitors about the legal implications of what he had learned. Eleanor dressed carefully that morning, choosing a deep blue gown that had sat unworn in her wardrobe for years, a gift from her father that she had never felt confident enough to wear in a house that made her feel small. Today, she felt different. Today, for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Hall, she felt like herself. She descended the stairs to find the household staff watching her with new eyes, a mixture of curiosity, respect, and something that might have been hope. Margaret Wells met her at the bottom of the staircase, wiping her hands on her apron, and offered a small, knowing smile. "Good morning, my lady," she said, and there was warmth in the greeting that had not existed before, an acknowledgement of a shift in status that everyone in the house now understood without needing further explanation. "Will you be taking breakfast in the dining room today?" "Yes," Eleanor said, straightening her shoulders. "I believe I will." She walked into the dining room and sat at the head of the table, a seat she had never once occupied in 5 years of marriage, always deferring to Cassius's position at the head, while she took a smaller seat near the middle. Today she claimed the seat as though it had always belonged to her, and when Cassius finally returned late that afternoon, pale and clearly exhausted from a day spent consulting lawyers, he found his wife sitting in his customary place, calmly reviewing correspondence with an expression of quiet, unshakable confidence. He said nothing about the seat. He simply sat down across from her, in the chair she had occupied for years, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with everything that had changed, and everything that remained uncertain about the future of their marriage. In the days that followed, Cassius's lawyers confirmed what Nathaniel Cole had already told Eleanor months before. The treaty was authentic, its terms binding, and there was no legal path available to challenge her claim, without risking further exposure of just how much territory had quietly slipped from Vaughn control over the generations, through neglect and assumption, rather than any legitimate right. The lawyers advised caution, urging Cassius to seek reconciliation with his wife, rather than confrontation, warning him plainly that any attempt to seize her lands by force or manipulation would only invite scrutiny from the crown, scrutiny that might reveal further weaknesses in his own increasingly fragile finances. Cassius received this advice with visible frustration, pacing the length of his study, while his solicitor, a cautious man named Peter Grimsby, tried to explain the delicate position he now found himself in. "Your Grace," Peter said carefully, "the Duchess holds every legal advantage. Any attempt to contest the treaty publicly would draw attention to records that, frankly, do not favor your family's historical claims to that territory in the first place. It would be wiser, in my professional opinion, to approach Lady Eleanor with respect and seek a cooperative arrangement rather than risk further embarrassment." "Cooperative arrangement," Cassius repeated bitterly. "You mean I must go crawling to my own wife and beg for access to lands I have managed my entire life?" "I mean," Peter said, choosing his words with obvious care, "that circumstances have changed, and wise men adjust their approach when circumstances change. The alternative, Your Grace, is a prolonged and public legal battle that you are unlikely to win, one that would expose the full extent of the treaty to every noble family in the region and permanently damage your standing at court." Cassius said nothing further, but the words settled uncomfortably in his mind over the following days as he watched his household transform around him in small, unmistakable ways. Eleanor no longer waited quietly at the edges of conversations, no longer deferred automatically to his opinions on matters of the estate. She began reviewing the household accounts openly rather than in secret, correcting errors the steward had allowed to accumulate for years, and Cassius found himself, for the first time, genuinely curious about the sharp, capable mind that had apparently been hiding behind her quiet demeanor all along. The tenants on the eastern farmlands, upon learning of the change in ownership, began sending letters directly to Eleanor, rather than routing their concerns through Cassius's steward, as they had always done. Many of them had long harbored grievances about unfair rents and neglected repairs, issues that Cassius had never bothered to address personally, leaving such matters entirely to subordinates who prioritized efficiency over fairness. Eleanor read each letter carefully, and within weeks, she had begun making decisions that directly affected the daily lives of hundreds of families who had never before had reason to think of her as anything more than a distant, unremarkable figure attached to the Duke's household. She reduced unfair rents that had burdened struggling farmers for years. She authorized repairs to a mill that had been falling into disrepair despite repeated requests from local families. She personally visited several of the villages within her new territory, accompanied only by Beatrice and a small escort, listening to concerns directly from the people whose lives depended on the decisions she now had the power to make. Word spread quickly through the countryside of a new landholder who listened where others had ignored, who acted where others had delayed, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely respected by people who had no reason to flatter her, beyond simple gratitude for fair treatment. Cassius watched this transformation with a complicated mixture of resentment and reluctant admiration. He had spent years believing his wife incapable of anything beyond quiet obedience, and now he watched her navigate complex negotiations with tenants and merchants with a confidence and competence that surpassed his own management of similar affairs. It grated against everything he had believed about her, about their marriage, about the natural order he had assumed governed their household. At the same time, his own social standing began to suffer in ways he had not anticipated. Word of the treaty spread quickly through the region's noble families, and with it came a subtle but unmistakable shift in how others treated him. Men who had once sought his favor now spoke to him with a new caution, aware that his wife controlled resources and influence that rivaled his own. Julian Ashcombe, having enjoyed his moment of gleeful revelation, now found himself the subject of Cassius's simmering resentment, and their friendship cooled considerably in the weeks that followed, though Julian seemed largely unbothered, apparently satisfied with having caused the disruption in the first place. Camille Hartley, sensing the changing tide within the household, grew noticeably less confident in her position. She had built her comfort within Ashcombe Hall on the assumption that Cassius's favor was the only currency that mattered, and now she watched with visible unease as servants began treating Eleanor with new deference while her own status remained precarious, dependent entirely on a man whose own power seemed increasingly uncertain. "You seem troubled," Eleanor observed one afternoon, encountering Camille in the garden where she had once endured the young woman's cruel curiosity. There was no malice in the observation, only a calm, almost detached interest. Camille's usual confidence faltered. "Everything has changed," she said, an admission that seemed to surprise even herself. "I do not know what my place is in this house anymore." "Perhaps that is a question you should have asked yourself before building your comfort on another woman's suffering," Eleanor said, not unkindly, but without softening the truth either. "I bear you no particular ill will, Camille, but I will not pretend the changes in this house are unwelcome to me, even if they leave you uncertain of your footing." Camille said nothing further, and within a month, she had quietly left Ashcombe Hall altogether, seeking better fortune with a lord whose position seemed more stable than the increasingly complicated situation surrounding the Duke and Duchess of Vaughan. Beyond the walls of the household, other noble families began actively courting Eleanor's favor, recognizing the significant power now attached to her name. Invitations arrived at Ashcombe Hall, addressed specifically to the Duchess rather than to the Duke and Duchess together, a subtle but pointed shift in social convention that Cassius noticed with growing discomfort. Lord Harold Pembridge himself, whose gathering had first exposed the truth of the treaty, began sending personal correspondence to Eleanor regarding matters of regional trade, treating her as a legitimate and significant political figure in her own right, rather than merely an extension of her husband's household. Eleanor navigated this new attention carefully, aware that many of these overtures came from men eager to align themselves with her wealth and influence, rather than any genuine respect for her judgment. She accepted invitations selectively, cultivated relationships with those who demonstrated genuine interest in her opinions rather than simple flattery, and slowly began building a network of alliances entirely separate from those Cassius had cultivated throughout his own career. One evening, several weeks after the revelation at Lord Pembridge's gathering, Cassius approached her in the drawing room where she sat reviewing correspondence from several tenant representatives. He hesitated at the doorway, an unusual uncertainty in his posture that Eleanor had never seen from him before. "May I speak with you?" he asked, and the question itself, phrased with something resembling genuine respect rather than command, was enough to make Eleanor look up with surprise. "Of course," she said, setting aside her papers. Cassius entered the room and sat across from her, and for a long moment, he seemed to struggle with how to begin. "I have spent the past weeks watching you manage affairs that I never believed you capable of handling," he finally said. "I do not say this easily, Eleanor, but I have been wrong about you, in ways I am only beginning to understand." Eleanor waited, saying nothing, allowing him the space to continue without interruption. "I married you for land I considered insignificant," he continued, "and I treated you, from the very first days of our marriage, as though your only value lay in that small dowry. I dismissed your intelligence, mocked your quietness, and made no effort to know the person you actually were, beneath the silence I forced upon you through years of contempt. I am not proud of this, and I do not expect you to forgive it easily, or perhaps at all." It was the closest thing to an apology Cassius had ever offered her, and Eleanor found herself studying his face carefully, searching for the sincerity beneath the words, uncertain whether this sudden humility stemmed from genuine remorse or simple recognition of the shifted power between them. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked finally. "Is it because you regret your cruelty, or because you fear what I might do with the power I now hold?" Cassius was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, there was an honesty in his voice that surprised them both. "I think perhaps it is both. I would be lying if I claimed the treaty, and everything that has followed has not frightened me. But watching you these past weeks, watching the respect you have earned from tenants and lords alike, has also forced me to confront how badly I misjudged you from the very beginning. You are not the quiet, forgettable woman I believed I married, Eleanor. I do not know if that realization comes too late to matter, but I did not want to continue pretending otherwise." Eleanor sat with his words for a long moment before responding. "It is not too late for honesty, Cassius, even if it may be too late for the marriage we might have built had you offered this honesty 5 years ago. I cannot promise you forgiveness, simply because circumstances have forced you to see me differently, but I am willing to have this conversation, which is more than I believed possible only months ago." It was not reconciliation, not yet, but it was the first genuine exchange they had shared in years, and as Cassius left the room that evening, Eleanor found herself sitting alone with a complicated tangle of emotions, cautious hope tangled with old resentment, curiosity about what might yet come tangled with the memory of years spent enduring his contempt. She did not know, in that quiet moment, exactly what shape her future would take. But she understood that the woman she had become over the past months, the woman who now held claim to half a kingdom and the respect of thousands of people who depended on her judgment, would never again allow herself to be reduced to silence and obedience simply because someone else wished it so. Winter deepened over Ashcombe Hall, and with it came a new rhythm to the household, one built not on Cassius's absolute authority, but on a careful, uneasy balance of power that neither of them had fully learned to navigate. Eleanor spent her mornings managing correspondence from her northern territories, meeting with Nathaniel Cole whenever he traveled south to consult with her, and increasingly involving herself in decisions that affected the combined estates of both families. Cassius, forced by circumstance to acknowledge her authority over half of what he had once considered exclusively his own, found himself in the unfamiliar position of needing her cooperation to accomplish even simple tasks that had once required nothing but his own signature. The river mills proved to be the first significant test of this new arrangement. The mills sat directly on the border between the traditionally Vaughn-controlled lands and the territory now claimed through Eleanor's treaty rights, and their operation required cooperation between both halves of the estate to manage water rights, grain distribution, and the wages owed to dozens of workers who depended on the mills for their livelihood. Cassius had always managed the mills through a steward who prioritized profit over fairness, often shorting workers' wages during lean months, while ensuring the Duke's own income remained untouched. When Eleanor reviewed the mill's accounts for the first time, she discovered discrepancies that had gone unnoticed, or perhaps deliberately ignored, for years. Workers had been paid less than their contracts specified, with the difference quietly absorbed into the estate's general funds. She brought this information to Cassius directly, laying the ledgers before him in his study with the same calm precision she had once used to review household accounts in secret. "This is theft," she said simply. "Whether you knew of it or not, your steward has been stealing from workers who have no power to challenge him. I will not allow this to continue on the portion of the mill operation that falls under my authority, and I would ask that you address it on your side as well." Cassius studied the ledgers with a frown, clearly uncomfortable with the accusation, but unable to dispute the numbers before him. "I did not know," he admitted, and there was something almost sheepish in the confession. "I trusted the steward to manage these details." "Perhaps it is time you stopped trusting blindly and started paying attention," Eleanor said, not unkindly, though the words carried weight. "I do not say this to shame you, Cassius. I say it because if we are to share authority over this land, we must also share responsibility for how it is managed. I have no interest in presiding over cruelty, simply because it existed before I arrived." To his credit, Cassius agreed to dismiss the steward and implement fair wages across the mill's operations, a decision that earned quiet gratitude from the workers, and, though he would not have admitted it easily, a grudging respect for his wife's insistence on fairness, even when it cost him personally. It was a small victory, but it marked the beginning of a pattern that would define their evolving partnership over the following months. Disagreements that no longer ended in Cassius's unilateral dismissal of her concerns, but in genuine negotiation, however uncomfortable that process often proved to be. Not everyone within their social circle welcomed this transformation. Several of Cassius's old companions, men who had once enjoyed mocking Eleanor alongside him, found the new dynamic within the household deeply unsettling. They visited less frequently, uncomfortable in the presence of a duchess who no longer shrank into silence at their jokes, who instead met their comments with a level, unimpressed gaze that made the old cruelty feel suddenly petty and small. Julian Ashcombe, whose revelation had set this entire transformation into motion, found himself increasingly excluded from Cassius's circle, the Duke unable to forgive the humiliation of that winter gathering, even as he grudgingly acknowledged that the outcome had, in strange and unexpected ways, improved the management of his own estate. Eleanor's growing influence extended beyond the immediate household as well. She began attending regional council meetings that addressed trade and land disputes across the Northern Territories, meetings that had previously been attended exclusively by male landholders who viewed such gatherings as beyond a woman's proper concern. Her presence initially drew skepticism and quiet resistance, older lords exchanging doubtful glances as she took her seat at the table, clearly uncertain whether to treat her as a legitimate participant or a curious novelty to be humored. That skepticism did not survive her first substantive contribution to the discussions. When a dispute arose over water rights along a river that ran through both Vaughan and Whitmore territory, Eleanor presented a detailed analysis of historical usage patterns and seasonal flow rates that she had personally researched through weeks of correspondence with local farmers and millers, information that none of the other landholders present had bothered to gather. Her proposal for a fair, rotating system of water access, one that balanced the needs of upstream and downstream farmers alike, was so thorough and evidently well-reasoned that even the most skeptical lords found themselves nodding in agreement by the meeting's end. "You have clearly done your research, my lady," remarked an older lord named Frederick Amberley, one of the more respected voices among the regional council. "I confess I did not expect such thoroughness." "I have found," Eleanor replied evenly, "that most disputes over land and resources persist not because they lack solutions, but because those with the power to solve them have never bothered to properly understand the problem. I merely took the time others did not." Word of her competence spread through the region's political circles, and within a few months, Eleanor found herself regularly consulted on matters far beyond her own immediate territory, her opinion sought by landholders who had once dismissed her entirely, her presence expected at gatherings where she had once been merely an accessory to her husband's status. Cassius watched this transformation with an increasingly complicated mixture of pride and unease, aware that his own standing among his peers now depended, in part, on his wife's growing reputation for fairness and competence, rather than his own accomplishments alone. Their marriage, meanwhile, existed in a strange and uncertain space, neither fully reconciled nor entirely estranged. Cassius made genuine efforts to include her in decisions he would once have made alone, seeking her counsel on matters of the estate with a deference that felt, at times, almost unfamiliar to both of them after years of established patterns. But old habits proved difficult to fully abandon, and there were moments when his frustration at the shifted balance of power revealed itself in flashes of the old contempt, quickly suppressed but not entirely erased. One such moment came during a disagreement over the management of the eastern farmland's harvest, when Cassius, frustrated by Eleanor's insistence on distributing surplus grain to struggling tenant families rather than selling it at premium prices to merchants in the capital, snapped at her with an echo of his old cruelty. "You would bankrupt this estate with your sentimentality," he said sharply, "giving away profit to people who have no claim to it beyond your misplaced pity." Eleanor did not flinch, but she met his gaze with a steadiness that made him immediately regret the outburst. "Those families worked the land that produced this harvest," she said calmly. "They have every claim to it, and I will not watch children go hungry through a difficult winter, simply so we might add a few more coins to an already substantial fortune. If this is sentimentality, Cassius, then I am content to be sentimental." But do not mistake my kindness for weakness. I hold equal authority over this decision, and I intend to exercise it." Cassius fell silent, the old instinct to dismiss her opinion warring visibly with the new reality he had been forced to accept. In the end, he said nothing further, and the surplus grain was distributed as Eleanor had insisted, though the tension between them lingered for several days afterward, an uncomfortable reminder that old patterns of cruelty did not simply disappear because circumstances had changed. Despite these occasional flashes of old resentment, something genuine had begun to grow between them as well, a grudging respect that neither had anticipated when their marriage first began. Cassius found himself, almost against his will, admiring the very qualities he had once dismissed as boring or insignificant: the careful patience, the sharp intelligence, the quiet strength that had apparently been present all along, simply waiting for an opportunity to be expressed. Eleanor, for her part, found herself occasionally softening toward the man who had caused her so much pain, recognizing in his awkward attempts at partnership something that might, with time and continued effort, grow into a genuine and equal marriage, rather than the hollow arrangement they had endured for years. Whether that growth would prove possible remained an open question as winter gave way to the first signs of spring, but Eleanor no longer approached her future with the resigned acceptance that had once defined her existence at Ashcombe Hall. She had discovered, through months of careful strategy and quiet perseverance, that her own worth had never depended on Cassius's recognition of it, that the power she now held had been present within her all along, waiting only for the right circumstances to reveal itself. Whatever came next in her marriage, she faced it now as an equal, not a supplicant, and that fundamental shift changed everything about how she moved through the world. The full weight of Cassius's past cruelty caught up with him in the early days of spring, when a series of scandals began surfacing among the noble families who had once considered him an unassailable figure of wealth and authority. The first blow came from an unexpected source, a former mistress named Isabel Fenwick, whom Cassius had discarded years before Camille Hartley ever arrived at Ashcombe Hall. Isabel, bitter over the way she had been treated and emboldened by the visible shift in power within the Vaughan household, began speaking openly at social gatherings about the Duke's history of casual cruelty, not only toward his wife, but toward every woman who had ever depended on his favor. Her stories spread quickly through the same social circles that had once celebrated Cassius as a charming, if occasionally sharp-tongued figure of the aristocracy. Details emerged that painted a far less flattering portrait than the one he had carefully cultivated over the years: tales of broken promises, cruel dismissals, and a pattern of treating those beneath him in station as though their feelings carried no weight whatsoever. Combined with the ongoing gossip about the treaty and his wife's newfound power, these revelations began to erode the foundation of respect Cassius had spent his entire adult life building among his peers. Julian Ashcombe, still nursing his own grievances over the cooling of their friendship, did little to defend Cassius when these stories circulated, and in some cases seemed to actively encourage their spread, perhaps as a final act of petty revenge for being excluded from his former friend's social circle. Other lords who had once sought Cassius's company began distancing themselves, wary of associating too closely with a man whose reputation was crumbling in real time, while simultaneously courting favor with Eleanor, whose reputation for fairness and competence continued to grow with each passing month. Cassius found himself, for the first time in his life, experiencing something close to the isolation and dismissal he had inflicted on his wife for years. Invitations that had once arrived without fail now came less frequently, and when he did attend gatherings, he noticed the subtle shifts in how others treated him, a coolness that had not existed before, a wariness in conversation that suggested his words no longer carried the automatic weight they once had. It was a humbling experience, and though he struggled against acknowledging it, the parallel between his current isolation and the years of dismissal he had forced upon Eleanor did not escape him entirely. "You seem troubled," Eleanor observed one evening, finding him alone in his study, staring at correspondence he had not bothered to open. "I am learning," he said slowly, "what it feels like to be spoken of with contempt in rooms where I am not present. I confess I do not care for the lesson." "No one enjoys such lessons," Eleanor replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. "But perhaps there is value in understanding, even now, what your careless cruelty cost me for so many years. I do not say this to wound you further, Cassius, I say it because I believe genuine change requires genuine understanding, not simply the fear of consequences. Cassius looked up at her, and for a long moment, something raw and unguarded crossed his face, an expression she had never seen from him before in all their years of marriage. I have spent months telling myself that I regret how I treated you, he said quietly. But sitting here now, feeling the weight of judgment from people I once considered my equals, I think perhaps I am only now beginning to truly understand what that regret should feel like. It is one thing to acknowledge a wrong in the abstract. It is another to feel, even briefly, some small measure of what you must have endured. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, considering his words carefully before responding. I appreciate the honesty, Cassius. But understanding my suffering does not erase it. And I will not pretend that months of changed behavior undo years of cruelty. What I can offer you is this. I am willing to continue building whatever this marriage might become, based on who you choose to be from this point forward, rather than who you were before. But that offer comes with no guarantees, and no obligation on my part to forgive simply because circumstances have made forgiveness convenient for you. It was a harder truth than Cassius had perhaps expected to hear, but he accepted it without argument, recognizing in her measured response the same quiet strength that had carried her through years of his contempt, and emerged, against every expectation, stronger rather than broken. The scandal surrounding Cassius's past reached its peak when several of his creditors, sensing the shift in his social standing and growing wary of his financial stability, began calling in debts that had previously been extended without concern. It emerged, through careful investigation by Eleanor's own solicitors, that Cassius's finances were far more precarious than anyone within the household had realized. Years of extravagant spending on mistresses and entertainment, having eroded the estate's reserves far more significantly than his outward displays of wealth suggested. Without access to the resources now legally held by Eleanor through her treaty claim, Cassius faced the very real possibility of financial ruin, a prospect that would have been unthinkable only a year earlier. The irony was not lost on either of them. The man who had once mocked his wife's dowry as insignificant now found his own financial survival dependent, in large part, on her willingness to extend the cooperation and resources that their shared authority over the combined estates made possible. Eleanor did not gloat over this reversal, though she would have been forgiven for feeling some measure of satisfaction at how thoroughly circumstances had shifted. Instead, she approached the crisis with the same careful, practical mind she applied to every challenge, working alongside Nathaniel Cole and Peter Grimsby to restructure the estate's finances in a way that addressed the immediate debts, while establishing sustainable practices for the future. I did not have to help you, she told Cassius plainly, as they reviewed the restructuring plans together late one evening. I could have allowed your creditors to claim what they were owed, and watched you lose everything you once valued above me. I chose not to, not out of obligation, but because I believe this estate, and the people who depend on it, deserve better than the consequences of your past recklessness. Why? Cassius asked, genuinely curious. After everything I have done, why would you choose to save me from the consequences of my own choices? Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. Because I am not interested in revenge, Cassius. I spent years being made small by your cruelty, and I could have spent the rest of my life ensuring you felt an equivalent smallness in return. But that is not the life I want to build, not for myself, and not for the tenants and workers who depend on this estate remaining stable. I would rather build something better than simply tear down what came before out of spite. Her words settled over him with unexpected weight, and in the weeks that followed, as the estate's finances slowly stabilized under their combined management, Cassius found himself reflecting more deeply than he had in years on the kind of man he wanted to become, not merely for the sake of his own reputation, but because he had begun to genuinely respect the woman whose strength had carried them both through this crisis. It was not love, not yet, and perhaps not the kind of love that erased years of pain entirely, but it was something, a foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership, that neither of them had believed possible only a year before, when Eleanor had knelt silently on the marble floor, cleaning up broken glass while Cassius walked away without a second glance. By early summer, Cassius had made a decision that surprised nearly everyone within his household, including Eleanor herself. He requested a formal meeting with her, arranged not in his study, where he had always held the position of authority, but in the drawing room, where they might sit as equals. And he came prepared not with demands or negotiations, but with a genuine attempt at reconciliation that went beyond mere words. "I have spent the past several months reflecting on the man I have been," he began, once they were seated, "and I find that man deeply unworthy of the wife I actually married, rather than the wife I assumed I had settled for. I cannot undo the years of cruelty I inflicted upon you, Eleanor. I understand that no apology, however sincere, can erase what you endured, but I am asking, if you are willing to hear it, for the chance to build something different between us, based not on the authority I once claimed over you, but on genuine partnership and respect." Eleanor listened carefully, watching his face for any sign of the old manipulation she had learned to recognize over years of marriage, any hint that this apparent humility masked some deeper strategy to reclaim the control he had lost. She found none. Instead, she saw a man who had been genuinely humbled by circumstance, who had confronted, through painful experience, the consequences of his own cruelty, and who now stood before her with something that resembled authentic vulnerability. "I appreciate your words, Cassius," she said carefully. "But words alone will not rebuild what years of contempt destroyed. If you are genuine in this desire for partnership, I will require more than apologies. I will require transparency in all matters concerning our combined estates, genuine consultation on every decision that affects both our territories, and an end to the casual disrespect that defined our marriage for so long. I will not accept a partnership in name only, where you make decisions and simply inform me afterward as a courtesy." "I understand," Cassius said, "and I accept those conditions, not as punishment, but as the foundation any genuine partnership requires. There is more," Eleanor continued. "I will not simply forget the years of mockery, the mistresses paraded before me, the countless moments you made me feel worthless in my own home. I am willing to work toward a genuine marriage, Cassius, but that forgiveness, if it comes at all, will be earned through years of consistent, demonstrated change, not granted simply because you have finally recognized the value of what you nearly destroyed." Cassius nodded, accepting her terms without argument, and in the months that followed, he made genuine efforts to honor them. He consulted her on every significant decision regarding the estate, sought her opinion on matters he would once have handled entirely alone, and slowly, carefully, began treating her with the respect that should have defined their marriage from its very first days. It was not a swift transformation, and there were moments when old habits resurfaced, when frustration or pride tempted him toward the dismissive cruelty that had once come so naturally. But each time, he caught himself, corrected course, and made visible effort to honor the partnership he had committed to building. Eleanor, for her part, found herself gradually softening, not into the silent, obedient wife she had once been, but into something entirely new, a woman confident in her own worth, who could extend genuine warmth toward her husband, without sacrificing the strength she had built through months of hardship and perseverance. Their conversations, once filled with his dismissive commands and her careful silence, evolved into genuine discussions, debates over policy and land management that sometimes grew heated, but never again descended into the casual cruelty that had once characterized their exchanges. Their combined estates flourished under this new partnership, the practical benefits of genuine cooperation becoming evident in every aspect of their shared territories. Tenant satisfaction improved dramatically, as fair policies replaced the exploitative practices that had once defined estate management. Trade flourished along the river routes, as Eleanor's careful negotiations with neighboring landholders opened new markets that benefited both halves of the combined kingdom. Even Cassius's reputation among his peers began to recover, though now it rested on genuinely improved character rather than the superficial charm he had once relied upon, as word spread of his transformation from a careless, cruel duke into a man who had learned, through difficult experience, the value of respect and partnership. 6 months after their formal reconciliation conversation, Lord Harold Pembridge hosted another gathering, the same grand event that had once served as the setting for Cassius's public humiliation. This time, however, the atmosphere surrounding the Duke and Duchess of Vaughan had transformed entirely. Where once whispers had focused on mockery and scandal, now the conversation centered on genuine admiration for the remarkable partnership Eleanor and Cassius had built, the successful management of their combined territories, and the fair, thoughtful policies that had earned them respect throughout the region. Julian Ashcombe, still nursing old resentments, attempted one final barb as the evening progressed, approaching the couple with the same gleeful malice he had once displayed. "I see the stone wall has learned to speak," he said, referring to his old insult with a sneer that clearly hoped to provoke some reaction. Cassius, rather than laughing along as he once might have, met Julian's gaze with a steady, unimpressed expression. "The stone wall," he said calmly, "has always been capable of speaking, Julian. I simply lacked the wisdom to listen. If you find yourself unable to recognize genuine strength when it stands before you, perhaps the failing lies with your own understanding, rather than my wife's character." Julian, clearly unprepared for this defense, muttered something incoherent and retreated into the crowd, his attempt at cruelty falling flat against a united front he had not anticipated. Eleanor glanced at Cassius with genuine surprise, and something in her expression, some small measure of warmth that had not existed there in years, made him feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that perhaps their partnership might yet grow into something resembling the genuine love that had never existed between them at the start of their marriage. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself engaged in conversation with several regional lords about proposed changes to trade regulations along the northern rivers, her opinions sought and respected in ways that would have seemed impossible only a year before. She caught Cassius watching her from across the room, his expression unmistakably proud rather than resentful, and when their eyes met, he offered her a small, genuine smile, rather than the dismissive indifference that had once defined his attention toward her. Later that evening, as their carriage carried them back toward Ashcombe Hall through the quiet countryside, Cassius reached across the space between them and gently took her hand, a small gesture that carried more weight than any of his earlier apologies. "I do not deserve the woman you have become," he said quietly, "but I intend to spend whatever years remain to us, proving myself worthy of the partnership you have offered me, despite everything I once did to destroy it." Eleanor did not pull her hand away, though she did not yet offer the full warmth of forgiveness he perhaps hoped to hear. "Prove it through consistency, Cassius, not through words spoken in the glow of a pleasant evening. That is all I ask, and it is enough for now." He nodded, accepting her measured response without complaint, understanding at last that genuine trust could not be rushed or demanded, only earned through patient, sustained effort over time. As the carriage rolled on through the darkness, Eleanor looked out at the countryside, at lands that belonged to her by right and by inheritance, at a future that stretched before her filled with possibility, rather than the quiet despair that had once defined her existence within these very same borders. A full year passed since the night Julian Ashcombe first revealed the truth of Eleanor's inheritance at Lord Pembridge's winter gathering, and the transformation within Ashcombe Hall stood as evidence of just how completely circumstances could change when someone long underestimated finally claimed the power that had been hers all along. Eleanor no longer moved through the halls of her home with the careful, quiet steps of a woman trying to remain unnoticed. She walked with purpose now, greeted by servants who had watched her endure years of cruelty, and now took genuine pride in serving a duchess who had earned every measure of the respect surrounding her. The combined territories of the Vaughan and Whitmore estates had become a model for fair and prosperous land management throughout the northern region, drawing attention from lords and ladies who traveled significant distances simply to study the policies that Eleanor had implemented, policies that balanced profit with genuine care for the tenants and workers whose labor made that prosperity possible. She had built, through months of careful strategy and quiet perseverance, something far more significant than simple wealth or legal claim. She had built a legacy defined by fairness, competence, and genuine strength, qualities that no one at Ashcombe Hall had ever thought to look for beneath her quiet exterior during those first difficult years of her marriage. Margaret Wells, still presiding over the kitchens after all these years, often remarked to the younger servants about the remarkable change she had witnessed in the Duchess she had comforted through so many painful evenings. "I always knew there was more to her than His Grace ever bothered to see," she would say, kneading dough with the same steady hands that had once offered quiet comfort to a woman who seemed, in those early years, entirely without hope. It only took the rest of the world catching up to what some of us understood all along. Beatrice, who had remained Eleanor's most trusted companion throughout the entire transformation, found herself elevated within the household as well, given greater responsibility and genuine respect for the loyalty she had shown during the most difficult years of her mistress's marriage. She often thought back to that carriage ride to Whitmore Manor, the moment she had first noticed something different in Eleanor's bearing, the candle lighting in a room that had long been dark, and she took quiet pride in having witnessed the beginning of a transformation that had reshaped not only one marriage, but an entire region's understanding of what a woman could accomplish when finally given the opportunity to reveal her true capabilities. Cassius, too, had changed in ways that extended far beyond his relationship with Eleanor. The humbling experience of watching his own reputation crumble, of feeling the isolation and dismissal he had once inflicted on others, had left a permanent mark on his character. He no longer surrounded himself with companions who valued cruelty and casual disrespect as forms of entertainment. He had distanced himself entirely from Julian Ashcombe and the circle of friends who had once encouraged his worst impulses, choosing instead to cultivate relationships built on genuine mutual respect, following the model that Eleanor had demonstrated through her own patient, thoughtful approach to leadership and partnership. Their marriage, while not without its ongoing challenges and occasional friction, had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined during those first bitter years. Cassius consulted Eleanor on every significant decision, valued her judgment above his own, on matters where her expertise exceeded his, and had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, to offer genuine warmth and respect, rather than the casual cruelty that had once defined his treatment of her. Eleanor, in turn, had allowed herself to soften toward him, not out of obligation or the erasure of past pain, but through genuine recognition that people could change when given both the opportunity and the honest desire to do so. She had not forgotten the years of mockery, the broken glass she had knelt to clean while he walked away without concern, the mistresses paraded before her, the countless moments of dismissal and contempt that had once defined her daily existence. But she had chosen, deliberately and with full understanding of what she was doing, to build a future rather than remain trapped in the resentment of the past. It was not weakness that led her to this choice, but strength, the same quiet, patient strength that had carried her through years of suffering, and eventually into a position of genuine power and respect. On a warm afternoon in early autumn, exactly 1 year after the fateful gathering that had changed everything, Eleanor stood in the gardens of Ashcombe Hall, tending to the roses that had always provided her with quiet comfort during the darkest years of her marriage. Cassius found her there, watching for a moment before approaching, and she looked up to meet his gaze with an openness that would have been impossible during those early years of careful, guarded silence. "I have been thinking," he said, settling beside her among the roses, "about the man I was when you first arrived at this house, and the man I have become through the difficult lessons of this past year. I do not know if I will ever fully deserve the partnership you have offered me, Eleanor, but I intend to spend the rest of my life trying." "You do not need to earn perfection, Cassius," she said, continuing her careful work among the flowers. "You need only continue choosing kindness and respect over the cruelty that once came so easily to you. That choice, made consistently over time, is worth more than any grand gesture or eloquent apology." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the autumn sun warming the garden around them, and Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment, from a frightened, silenced bride, kneeling to clean up broken glass, to a woman who held legal claim to vast territories and the genuine respect of thousands who depended on her judgment. She thought of her grandfather, Edmund Whitmore, a man she had barely known in life, whose final act had reshaped her entire existence, granting her not merely wealth and land, but the opportunity to discover strength within herself that she had never known existed. The quiet bride Cassius had once mocked for years was gone entirely now, replaced by a woman who commanded respect not through the power of her inheritance alone, but through the genuine character she had revealed once circumstances finally allowed her true self to emerge. Ashcombe Hall, once a place of quiet suffering and careful survival, had become instead a home built on genuine partnership, fair leadership, and the kind of mutual respect that neither Eleanor nor Cassius could have imagined possible during those difficult early years. As the sun began to set over the gardens, casting long golden light across the roses Eleanor had tended with such careful devotion, she allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to feel genuinely content with the life she had built. Not because the pain of the past had been erased, but because she had transformed that pain into something far more powerful, a foundation of strength, wisdom, and genuine authority that would define not only her own future, but the futures of everyone whose lives now depended on the fair and thoughtful leadership she had fought so hard to establish. The quiet Duchess had found her voice at last, and she had no intention of ever surrendering it again. Years later, the story of Eleanor and Cassius Vaughn had become something of a quiet legend throughout the Northern Territories, told not as a tale of romance alone, but as a lesson in the danger of underestimating those who choose silence over confrontation, patience over impulsive reaction. Young women across the region grew up hearing whispered versions of the story, of a duchess mocked and dismissed for years, who ultimately revealed herself to hold more power and wisdom than the husband who had once believed her worthless. And many took quiet comfort in the reminder that strength did not always announce itself loudly, that it could grow patiently beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Eleanor herself had grown into a figure of considerable influence. Her counsel sought not only on matters concerning her own territories, but on broader questions of governance and fair leadership throughout the entire region. She established schools for tenant children on both the Vaughn and Whitmore lands, ensuring that daughters as well as sons received an education that might prepare them for lives of greater opportunity than she herself had once believed possible. She mentored young women who found themselves in circumstances similar to those she had once endured, offering practical guidance on managing estates, understanding legal rights, and recognizing their own worth regardless of how others chose to treat them. Cassius, for his part, had become known throughout the region as a genuinely reformed man, his transformation so thorough and consistent over the years that even his harshest early critics eventually acknowledged the sincerity of his change. He often spoke, in private conversations with other lords struggling with their own marriages or their own character flaws, about the painful but necessary lessons he had learned through nearly losing everything he valued, about the profound difference between the shallow charm he had once relied upon and the genuine respect he had eventually learned to offer his wife and the people who depended on his leadership. Their partnership, built now on years of demonstrated trust and mutual respect, had grown into something that neither of them could have imagined during those bitter early years of their marriage. They raised children together who grew up witnessing genuine partnership rather than the cruelty that had once defined their parents' relationship, children who learned from both their mother's quiet strength and their father's hard-won humility that respect, once broken, could be rebuilt through patient, consistent effort, though never without genuine acknowledgement of the pain that had come before. The combined territories of their estates continued to flourish under their joint leadership, becoming widely regarded as among the most fairly managed and prosperous lands in the entire kingdom. Tenants who had once suffered under exploitative practices now lived with genuine security, their concerns heard and addressed by leaders who had learned, through hard experience, the true cost of ignoring the voices of those with less power. Merchants and traders sought out agreements with the Vaughn estate, specifically because of its reputation for fairness, and other noble families increasingly looked to Eleanor's policies as a model for their own governance. Nathaniel Cole, who had guided Eleanor through those crucial early months of discovering and securing her inheritance, remained a trusted advisor throughout the years that followed, often remarking with quiet pride on how thoroughly his old friend Edmund Whitmore's final gift had reshaped not only his granddaughter's life, but the broader fortunes of an entire region. Beatrice, too, remained at Eleanor's side for the rest of her career, eventually overseeing the household staff with the same loyalty and dedication she had shown during the darkest years of her mistress's marriage, and Margaret Wells continued presiding over the kitchens well into her later years, always ready to share stories with newer servants about the remarkable Duchess who had transformed from a quiet, suffering bride into one of the most respected figures in the entire kingdom. Looking back on the journey that had brought her to this point, Eleanor often reflected that the true turning point in her life had not been the moment she learned of her inheritance, nor even the moment Julian Ashcombe's careless words exposed the truth to the world. The true turning point, she had come to understand, was the quiet decision she had made in those early years to endure with dignity rather than break under cruelty, to observe and learn and build knowledge in private, even when no one around her believed she possessed the capacity for anything beyond simple obedience. That quiet, patient strength had been the true foundation of everything that followed, the inheritance and the treaty, merely the instruments through which her already existing worth had finally been revealed to a world that had, for far too long, refused to see it. The story of the quiet bride and the duke who had mocked her for years eventually faded into the broader history of the Northern Territories, remembered by later generations less as a tale of scandal or reversal of fortune, and more as an enduring reminder that genuine strength rarely announces itself through loud declarations, but instead grows quietly, patiently, waiting for its moment, and that those who choose cruelty over respect, indifference over genuine partnership, do so at their own eventual peril. Eleanor Vaughn lived the remainder of her long and remarkable life as a woman fully in command of her own destiny, respected by peers and tenants alike, remembered not merely as the Duchess who had once been mocked, but as the woman who had transformed her own quiet suffering into a legacy of fairness, wisdom, and enduring strength that outlasted every insult ever hurled against her in the years before the world finally learned to see her true worth.